The custom steel tubular frame that comes with the 29 SSK assembly kit has a black finish. For ease of assembly and safety, we place 4 jack stands under the main frame rails, supporting it approximately 18 inches off the floor. We have thoroughly inspected, cleaned, and painted all components. Where necessary, we have replaced worn parts. Normally, we paint all pieces with a high-quality black enamel paint. For ease of visibility, we have left the parts in red primer. Later, we will paint them black. In addition, most original hardware has been painted a contrasting color. Before we can mount the Chevette rear axle and suspension to the frame, it is necessary to make a minor modification, enabling us to use different shock absorbers. First, we turn the rear axle assembly over so the bottom of the spring recess is on top. 2 rear lower shock mounting plates come with the assembly. These are identical and interchangeable from side to side. We locate the mounting plates on top of the spring recess and hold them flush against the lip of the spring pocket. Then we locate the holes with a center punch, or we could just as easily use a short burst of paint from a spray can to mark the hole locations. Utilizing our electric drill along with a 3/8" drill bit, 2 holes are drilled through the spring mount on each side. After the holes have been drilled, we take our new mounting plates and bolt the recommended shocks to each plate using 5/16 by 1 1/4 inch bolts with flat washers, lock washers, and nuts. When we refer to the diameter of the bolt, we are talking about the diameter of the shank. The length is from the underside of the head to the end of the shaft. We use grade 5 bolts, distinguished by the 3 diagonal lines on the bolt head. In most cases, slightly longer bolts than those listed in the manual can be used with no problem. We slide the bolts through the shock and plate, securing them in place. The shock mount holes are pre-punched through each plate when they're shipped. After the shocks have been secured to the mounting plates, we slide them through the bottom of each spring recess. We use 5/16 by 1 1/4 inch bolts with flat washers, lock washers, and nuts to secure the shock mounting plates to the axle assembly, passing the bolt heads through from inside each spring recess. When the nuts have been tightened, we return the unit to its upright position. The lower spring insulators are placed in each spring recess along with the springs and top insulators. We now roll the axle assembly under the frame. It is ready for installation. With the rear end assembly in position below the frame, we lift the bracket or brace located at the front of the axle extension against the mounts that are part of the frame. The bracket goes against the bottom of the frame. Using 3/8 diameter by 1 1/2 inch long bolts, flat washers, lock washers, and nuts, we secure the axle extension to the frame. For now, we do not fully tighten these bolts. Next, we position the bushings at the front of the rear control arms inside of the mounts welded to the chassis. Where necessary, we tap the control arm with a hammer so that the hole through the bushing lines up with the holes through the brackets. Occasionally, we find that we may need to enlarge the mounting bracket hole slightly to line up with the bushing. To accomplish this, we use a rotary rasp on our electric drill. They are available in any hardware store. The original Chevette bolts are passed through the bracket and control arm and secured with the original nuts. The appropriate socket and ratchet are used, along with an open end or box wrench. The nuts and bolts on each side are tightened. Our floor jack is now placed under the differential at the center of the axle housing. At this point, we would like to take a moment to discuss the rear springs. Because the weight distribution of our replica car will be different from the original Chevette with more weight at the rear, we find that the stock springs may not be heavy enough, or because of wear and age, need replacement. After the car is completely finished and we have tested it, we can easily replace the rear springs with the suggested new ones found in our instruction manual. For now, the stock springs will work fine. We place the springs and insulators into position and slowly elevate the entire assembly. Placing the springs into position under the upper spring mounts, we compress the springs slightly to enable the studs on the top of the shocks to pass through the mounting holes on the chassis. A little patience is required here to guide each side through the shock mounting holes, or when necessary, some weight can be placed on the chassis. When the studs have extended and passed sufficiently through the mounting holes, the hardware supplied with the new shock absorbers is used to secure the shocks to the frame. The correct socket and ratchet are used to thoroughly tighten the nuts. At this point, the only thing left for us to do to complete the rear suspension is to attach the stabilizer bar to the bracket located on the driver's side of the frame. The bushing of the stabilizer bar is arranged so that its hole center lines up with the mounting holes in the bracket. When necessary, we tap the bushing into place. The original Chevette bolt and nut are used to secure the stabilizer bar to the chassis. The appropriate tools are used to tighten the nut. Our floor jack is lowered and removed. We have now completed the installation of the rear axle and suspension system. Later, we will use a torque wrench to tighten the lower control arm bolts, rear stabilizer bar, and shock mounting bolts to the correct specifications found in our factory service or shop manual. Next, the entire front suspension, along with the rack and pinion steering and crossmember, will be mounted to our frame. Before we can do this, we need to make a small modification. The motor mounts that are attached to the crossmember will be relocated to brackets that are part of our new frame. A chisel and hammer are used to loosen each mount, and then they are simply unscrewed and saved for later use. We want to thoroughly inspect the condition of the motor mounts. If necessary, we can replace them with new mounts available from any auto supply store. Previously, we inspected all front suspension components, along with the brakes, ball joints, and steering, replacing any worn or damaged parts. The entire assembly was then cleaned and painted. Once the motor mounts have been removed, we use a tape measure and mark a line 1 inch above the lower crossmember mounting hole. Using a China marker or grease pencil, we draw a line around both sides of the motor mount bracket. An electric saber saw or a hacksaw with the appropriate blade is used to cut the upper portion off on each side of the front crossmember. We use a file or grinder to clean up the edges. Having completed our motor mount modification, we can now install the entire assembly. Our floor jack, which can be rented from any local tool supply store, or in some cases borrowed from a service station with a small deposit, is used to elevate the crossmember into position. We do this very slowly. We want to align all mounting holes correctly. The 2 inner crossmember mounting holes, located on each side of the crossmember on both the driver and passenger sides, are aligned with the holes located in each crossmember mounting plate. The lower mounting hole just below the cut that was made to remove the motor mount bracket is aligned with the bracket located under the main frame rail. The bushing at the rear of the strut that attaches to each lower control arm is placed between its mount. It may be necessary to use a hammer to gently persuade hole alignment. The fit is very tight and patience is required. The original factory bolts and nuts are used to secure the entire assembly. First, the two bolts that secure the cross member on each side to the plates on the chassis are threaded into the holes that are tapped in the plates. The through bolt that secures the lower cross member mount to the bracket on the frame is inserted. Finally, we place the bolt through the lower strut bracket, passing it through the strut. The appropriate tools are used to tighten all bolts. When fabricating the firewall, we refer to the instruction manual for proper hole size and location. While a number of different materials can be used, a piece of sheet steel is preferable because of its fireproof properties. We use a tape measure and China marker or grease pencil to mark all hole locations, referring to the instruction manual. Alternatively, a firewall is available from the factory that has all of the holes pre-punched, including those necessary for air conditioning and heater hoses. If we choose to use the factory firewall, we could block off any undesired openings. A center punch is utilized to establish the hole locations. Then, referring to the factory manual, we use the correct size drill bits and hole saws to make all necessary openings. After we have finished fabricating the firewall, we use a quality primer in a convenient spray can and give both sides a good coat of paint. After the paint is dried, we place the firewall from the passenger side into position against the back of the upright frame members.